Hi, this is your Nerd Medic, and in this video let us talk about Galeazzi fracture. Galeazzi fracture is a fracture of distal 1/3 of radius. That is, over here, this is our radius bone and this is our ulnar bone. This is elbow joint. This is our wrist, and Galeazzi fracture represents the fracture of distal 1/3 of radius. Right. To understand better what Galeazzi fracture is, we have to first understand the anatomy of the forearm. So anatomy of the forearm is very simple, as I told you. Let's review that on a digital x-ray. Over here, this bone that you can see, this bone is your radius bone. This bone over here is ulna. This is the wrist joint. Over here, this is the elbow joint. And over here in the wrist joint, you have to see a very special thing. That is, over here somewhere you can see this part is known as the distal radio-ulnar joint. Radio-ulnar joint, or DRUJ, drudge. We will talk more about these things in the later part of this video. Now, what else we have to know right now? We will talk about Galeazzi fracture. Galeazzi fracture, the main fracture component is the fracture of the junction between the proximal 2/3, that is this part, and your distal 1/3. At the junction of proximal 2/3 and distal 1/3, you get the fracture, and that fracture is known as the Galeazzi fracture. With our basic orientation about the forearm bones on the digital x-ray, now we move on to the x-rays of Galeazzi fracture. As discussed, over here we can see the fracture line over here. That is the fracture between the distal 1/3 and proximal 2/3 over the radius bone. And what else we can see? Over here we can see that there is a disruption of the radio-ulnar joint. What? We can see there's a disruption of distal radio-ulnar joint. And there's another third component to it. That is, over here you can see there is either volar or dorsal deflection of distal radio-ulnar joint. In this case, we can see there is a dorsal deflection of the radio-ulnar joint. The radio-ulnar joint over here has moved away from the wrist and has gone dorsally. So what are the three components that we can see in case of a Galeazzi fracture? So the three components will be: one, the fracture itself between distal 1/3 and proximal 2/3. The component 2 is disruption of DRUJ, and the third is deflection of the DORJ in dorsal aspect or volar aspect. So these three together make the Galeazzi fracture. Now, how do we treat Galeazzi fracture? The treatment of Galeazzi fracture is very simple. We do open reduction and internal fixation of the fracture. And sometimes, if the distal radio-ulnar joint is too much deflected, we also address the deflection of the distal radio-ulnar joint.